Well, welcome everybody. I think we're in for a really interesting afternoon session. We're going to wake everybody up after lunch. Welcome to the Fission and Fusion session on charting a collaborative path to U.S. energy leadership. My name is Amy Roma. I'm a partner and global head of the energy practice group at the law firm of Hogan Lovells. And I'm just going to maybe set the scene for our discussion today and then ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. If anybody's been paying attention, we're seeing a whole lot of announcements coming out in fission and in fusion, and it's a really, really exciting announcement. So just in last October alone, we saw a whole bunch of announcements related to tech and AI and data centers and nuclear. So we saw the announcement with Microsoft to partner with Constellation for the restart of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant to provide power purely for data centers. That plant had been shut down. It was in decommissioning, and it has enough power to provide power for 800,000 homes or for the data centers that Microsoft needs. So it just lets you see how immense the power need is there. We also saw Google announce a partnership with Kairos Energy, who's already received 2 construction permits from the NRC to construct demonstration nuclear reactors for 500 megawatts of electricity. We saw Amazon make an announcement with X Energy for not just 5.5 gigawatts of power, but also anchoring a $500 million equity investment in X Energy itself. And Meta right now is doing an RFP that's a nuclear-related RFP, and that's just on the fission side. On the fusion side, we've seen a ton of announcements as well. Helion Energy is building, I think it's 7th generation prototype that's expected to be up and running this year that they anticipate will demonstrate net positive energy capable of being added to the grid. Commonwealth Fusion is building its next prototype up in Massachusetts. Both of them have received radioactive materials licenses from the respective states for those facilities. Commonwealth announced that it plans on building its first commercial fusion facility just across the river in Virginia. Helion announced a 50 megawatt fusion facility with Microsoft for later this decade, and then behind that, a 500 megawatt facility for Nucor Steel. And then kind of coming out of left field, when they came out of stealth, Pacific Fusion announced a $500 million Series A raise, of which I think Breakthrough may have been one of the investors in that, showing that there's just a lot of appetite and a lot of energy right now for both advanced next generation fission and fusion. On perhaps maybe the global landscape, we're seeing countries realize what their decarbonization goals and agendas can have when you don't factor in the need for baseload power. If you guys have been watching the news, you'll see that Germany is in an economic recession for 2 years in a row, with a 3rd year anticipated, largely driven by very high energy prices. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they had to go cold turkey off Russian natural gas. They decided they were going to shut down their nuclear power plants, which at a high accounted for 30% of the country's power. They did an over-reliance on wind and solar, and so they didn't have enough baseload power, and they're importing their energy from France. France, as many of you know, is 95% decarbonized grid. 70% of that comes from nuclear, about 15% comes from hydro. But it goes to show you where energy policies matter in making sure that the lights stay on, as well as energy remains affordable and reliable. And so with that setting, I want to turn to each of our panelists to introduce themselves and to talk about the areas that they've been working on in the fission and fusion space. Carly?
All right. Thanks very much, Amy. And if anyone had missed anything over the last couple of years, I think you just gave a fantastic summary of some of the many exciting things going on in this space. Just to share a little bit about my perspective, I'm a chemical engineer by background, began my career in the commercial nuclear space a number of years ago, mostly on the maintenance side, keeping old plants operating. After the accident at Fukushima Daiichi, that was actually the motivating factor for me to go back to school, got a graduate degree, moved into the startup space, eventually over to the investor side of things, and since then have been actively looking at the fusion space. Made 4 investments over the last 5 years in Commonwealth Fusion Systems and with Focused Energy with my prior fund, and now very excited to be supporting Theia Energy and Exemer Energy with Prelude Ventures, where I'm a principal. In terms of like what we're seeing out there, like there's an incredible amount of activity in the early technology development space on both of those sides. Right, like I think, and I'll let Phil speak to more of the fusion side of things. I think we're over 50 fusion companies at this point, the vast majority of which are based in the U.S., which is very exciting. We've been a center of innovation in that space for a long time, especially in the early days of technology development. On the fission space, I think we've gone from just a handful of folks who have been developing ideas for, it's been probably a decade for X-Energy, Kairos, TerraPower, several of those major players. But now we're seeing newer microreactors, a lot of activity in that space, a lot of technology development, project development companies, so folks filling in other parts of the ecosystem that have been largely ignored but are critical to this industry getting on its feet again. And then other folks in the advanced manufacturing and new materials, other R&D areas that I think we'll get into later might be very, very helpful to both sides of the nuclear fission industry and also the fusion energy space. So with that, here, Derek, I'll pass the ball over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. And I think between the two of you, you've covered the entirety of the fission fusion space today, which is really great. Everything that you said is so exciting right now, and that's why it's great to be in this space. So my name is Derek Gaston. I think I'm probably the resident nerd up here. That's my role. I've been at the National Labs for the last 20 years. So I was at Sandia National Lab and then Idaho National Lab. Primarily for the last 17 years, I've been developing massively parallel modeling and simulation tools, primarily focused on simulation of fission reactors and then crossing over into fusion every now and again whenever I got the opportunity. But just a little bit over a year ago, I took a role here at the Department of Energy in the Office of Nuclear Energy as a senior advisor for the Assistant Secretary of Nuclear Energy for the purposes of trying to help deploy nuclear reactors. So moving beyond trying to develop tools to help reactor developers design reactors and really wanting to dig in and see what I could do on the policy side to help get these reactors deployed. And so for the last year, I've been working both on 2 major teams within the Department of Energy. One is the Fusion Crosscut team, where I directly work to try to identify resources all across the Department of Energy to help accelerate the deployment of fusion within the United States. And then another kind of synergistic activity is the data center engagement team, which, as we all know, and as you spoke about earlier, there's been a ton of activity in the last year on data centers, in particular hyperscalers, coming out in support of nuclear energy. And so that team has been really focused on engaging with the private industry to try to get more nuclear energy on the grid. And so I really view those 2 activities as being very synergistic. And I think that we're at a moment where we have a lot of startups on both sides. We have a lot of fusion energy startups, as you mentioned. We have a lot of fission, or I don't know whether to say nuclear energy or fission energy up here. We have to be careful with those. But we have a lot of nuclear energy startups on the other side. And I kind of view these as kind of being in a similar position where we're trying to raise the raise the technology readiness level of both of these very important technologies and trying to get them deployed on the grid. And so I think it's important for us to recognize all the similarities between these areas and try to work together.
Thanks, Phil. And I just want to say, calling yourself the resident nerd at an energy conference is a very bold statement. Phil, can you introduce yourself and give some opening remarks?
Yeah, happy to. Hi, I'm Philippe Larochelle. I'm a partner at Breakthrough Energy Ventures. So I did a lot of things before being at Breakthrough Energy Ventures, including getting a PhD in physics working on antimatter machines. So I happily challenge you to a nerd off. But most importantly, I was actually an ARPA-E fellow from 2010 to 2012. So I have many fond memories of this room and this stage and everything that ARPA-E has done. And in particular, I want to give a huge shout out to the leadership that ARPA-E has shown in fusion, as well as fission. I take no credit for either. Both of those were not things that were going on when I was there. But it's been amazing to see just all of the new innovations that have happened within fusion and fission. And so Breakthrough Energy Ventures is a venture capital firm. We invest in things across the energy space trying to promote abundant and sustainable energy. We've got about $3 billion under management in a few different funds. We've got over 120 companies across the climate and energy space. But of those, we've got 5 fusion companies. So we've got Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which is a tokamak. We've got Pacific Fusion, which is a Z-pinch. We've got Type 1 Energy, which is a stellarator. We've got Exmer Energy, which is a laser-based approach. And then we've got Zap Energy, which is a different type of Z-pinch. And so even though we are not invested directly in fission ourselves, we've certainly looked at a lot of deals. Our chairman is Bill Gates, who is also the chairman of TerraPower. So we are big fans of fission, and we're still looking for opportunities in the space. But so far, most of our efforts, which are focused on the earlier stage, is really moving forward the technology readiness level of a few different approaches towards fusion. And as I mentioned, I wasn't focused on fusion, no pun intended, when I was at ARPA-E, because like a lot of you, I thought it was just too far off. And so in fact, our gateway drug to the space, like I think for a lot of people, was Commonwealth Fusion Systems. And what was really amazing about that is that what we learned was that there was this 50, 60, 70 years of amazing established science with this machine called the tokamak, where there's over 150 of those built and operating over the years that really helped us understand the scientific basis for it. But as most of you know, there's this giant machine in France called ITER. And to quote Dennis White of MIT, ITER was scientifically interesting, it was not commercially interesting. But what happened with CFS, and now I think is happening with these other concepts that are based on 50 plus years of really excellent fusion science, a lot of it coming from the DOE, some of it coming from the DOD, is that you now have scientifically rigorous systems that we think we understand how they behave, coupled with these component level advances that all of a sudden says, aha, I think we can commercialize this. So Carly and I were also at another panel at the Computer History Museum, I think a month or two ago. And what was amazing about being there is that I now liken what's happening in fusion to a lot like what happened with computers, right? So when people say, why should you be excited about fusion? Now, and specifically magnetic confinement fusion, I kind of say it's the same kind of reason you should have been excited about computers in the 1940s when someone invented the transistor. Coming from Charles Babbage, we kind of knew how these machines operated, but you were never going to have an iPhone or a large language model that was made possible by vacuum tubes, right? And so sometimes there are these component level advances that take something that is scientifically sound and now makes it commercially transformative. And so the equivalent in magnetic confinement is these new magnets, but then there's also the same story happening in pulse power and happening in lasers. So what we're seeing, and again, it's been an education on our part, is that, fusion is no longer 30 years away and always will be. It's too bad that's such a good joke. Instead, it might be 30 months away, when Spark comes online. And then in particular, our entire investment hypothesis is that we think that there's multiple concepts that all have some level of science, engineering, and commercialization risk. But these are all concepts that have a real shot at getting to a commercial power plant in the 2030s. Now that, alongside everything we're seeing in fission, which is a proven technology, means that, just like Secretary Wright said, what we really want is abundant, sustainable, energy-dense, deployable anywhere energy options. And now we have 2 really good candidates with both fission and fusion. And so, I just want to say that I think that most people in fusion are huge fans of fission. They think it should be deployed a lot more. And I think most people in fission would be like, well, it would be great if fusion worked. So I think everyone can win here as long as we put in the effort.
So a couple years ago, I was sitting on a plane reading The Economist, and the first line of the article, it was on whether Texas could ever become a Democratic state instead of a Republican state, and the first line was, turning Texas blue is like fusion. It would be transformative if it happened, but it's always 20 years away. And I remember thinking, well, if this line is making its way into The Economist in a political discussion, clearly fusion is doing something right because it's getting on more and more people's radar. So I just want to turn to what are the opportunities for fusion in the near term, and what are the challenges, and how do we overcome some of those challenges? So that's a pretty dense question, but Carly, I'm going to start with you, then I'm going to turn to you, Phil, and then I'm going to jump back to you to talk about maybe some fission things on that same question. So Carly?
Yes, and I think Phil already answered the question of which will happen first, fusion happening or Texas switching, looking at 2030s. So what's, in the fusion landscape, what are we excited about? What are we looking at? I think there's multiple steps, and some people have done a great job of laying this out, where it starts with component level advances. For Commonwealth Fusion, it started with them showing a 20 Tesla magnet. I think, Phil, you were there for that event. It looked exciting. And now we have other fusion companies who are going out and doing their version of what is that moment where you're like, okay, critical technology de-risk, check, let's move on to an integrated system. So on the high temperature superconducting tape side, we've seen multiple people do different generations of magnets. I think something that's really exciting is how fast the cost of tape has already come down. I would guess that it was over $100 a meter when CFS started, and I would say now it's like much lower than that. Not an order of magnitude yet, but it could get there in time. On the laser side, there's been advances. I mean, the cost of solid state lasers has come down. I think NIF ramping up their power was really huge for showing that you can actually get to ignition. There's other components that have been huge unlocks. I'm going to let Derek talk about. I think that's probably the biggest thing that's changed, honestly, is just you can simulate in weeks now what would have taken years. So we're excited about all those things. I actually forgot your question.
No, that's fine. It was, what are the challenges that you're seeing? So what are the opportunities, but also what are some of the challenges that need to be navigated?
Okay, so I did opportunities, right? Like we've got a lot of great stuff and simulations. Okay, cool. In terms of challenges, I mean, I think financing is something that we would all agree is a tricky problem to solve. In fusion specifically, that is the problem. There's been some creative efforts to bring different types of funding rounds together. What I think we really need to see is more different types of folks come to the table on the strategic side, on the federal government side. I'm hoping that we'll spend some time talking about some of the models that worked really well in fission to get some of these early projects launched. There's a bunch of great parallels there. So that's a big thing. The workforce, some of the basic research to back up the work that's being done. These fusion companies are moving as fast as possible, and it's so exciting to visit these companies because it changes month to month. But in terms of actually like going in and doing accelerated testing of the materials and every component, like that's going to take some time. And a lot of the national labs have done really great work in the past. There's parallels to TRISO fuel, for instance. That was like a 20-year effort by the national labs to get that to the point where now private companies can ramp up manufacturing. So we'd love to see more of that type of collaboration in the fusion sector as well.
Okay, Phil?
Well, Amy, you kind of talked about how fusion seems like it's seeping into the consciousness in the mainstream, and you quoted an Economist article. Well, I'm happy to report that The Economist will be having its first ever Fusion Fest in London on April 8th. So if any of you want to make a trip to the UK and see how fusion is really interacting with the folks who bring these large sources of capital and make really big decisions about the future of the world, this is just one in a long series of events of people taking fusion a lot more seriously and having it be in the conversation in the longer term about options for the hyperscalers and things like that, like we've seen with fission. So there's a tremendous amount of exciting stuff happening in fusion right now, and we could dig into a lot of details. You know, you talked about what are the key milestones in fusion. One of the things that's great about fusion, because we do diligence across the entire landscape, is there's actually a very transparent and straightforward way to measure progress, which is that, as we all know, the hard thing about fusion is not doing fusion. We started doing that before we did fission. The hard thing about fusion is getting to energy positive fusion. And we've understood what's necessary to do that since the 1950s. It's something called the Lawson criteria. And thanks to two people from ARPA-E who put out an amazing paper called Progress on the Lawson Criteria, we can now track exactly how the different concepts, a lot of the ones I listed, are making progress towards this energy break-even. And the great news is the lasers have already achieved it. The magnetic confinement is close behind, and there's some others who are making very good progress as well. So look, I could give you a long list of the science, the engineering, the commercialization challenges, and eventually how you get to low cost. You know, spoiler alert, we're very bullish that we think in the long term that fusion can get to very low cost. But as Carly said, if I had to pick one reason as to why we might not get across the finish line with fusion energy, I would say the biggest risk, not the only risk, but the biggest risk is that it's under-resourced. And so there I would say the opportunity, and especially in a room like this, is how can you really have the best combination of government support, which of course has been happening for over 50 years in the national labs and elsewhere, and the amazing dynamism of American industry and capitalism to really get fusion to market as soon as possible. And there, I think that there's an opportunity, which is instead of having a command and control system, you can have something that was actually modeled after what NASA did with SpaceX. And there's an opportunity for, you know, the risk-taking of private capital to kind of collaborate with the right level of government support to really get these things across the finish line by the 2030s. So lots of engineering and science risk, but I think that now the focus has to be how do we properly resource it.
That's great, and that's actually a good transition over to you, Derek, to talk on the fission side, because it's a little bit less of a science and engineering risk and over into a how do we commercially deploy and how do we de-risk that. So what are the opportunities and challenges you're seeing on the fission side?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, you know, there's kind of three different areas that I look at that are kind of propelling fission right now. So first of all, there's government action itself, things like ARDP, things like the Loan Program Office, the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera, all the tax credits that we have right now in the government that have really been kind of giving a tailwind to a lot of the fission industry right now. The second thing is just having a big spectrum of options for off-takers to choose from, right? So for the longest time, the only thing that fission had was gigawatt scale reactors, right? And so if you wanted to go into fission, you had to bring tens of billions of dollars and a gigawatt desire to even get into the game. But now we have a huge spectrum of options, all the way from, well, less than 1 megawatt even, but all the way from 1 megawatt microreactors to several hundred megawatt small modular reactors. And then we still have the brand new Gen 3 plus gigawatt scale reactors that bring a lot of extra new safety mechanisms, et cetera. And so I think that huge range of options is really one of the things that's driving the fission industry forward right now, right? Because customers that never would have bought into a gigawatt scale reactor can now see that actually maybe one of these smaller fission devices that costs a little bit less and we can build a little bit faster might actually fit into my energy profile, right? And I think that's where a lot of this is coming from. And then that moves over into the resource issue of needing to have enough money to get over that first of a kind hump, right? And I think that's one thing that both fission and fusion share, is that the first ones of these that we build are going to be expensive. There's kind of really no way around that, right? But once we gain knowledge about how to build them, both types of devices, the cost per unit is definitely going to come down, right? We have lots and lots of papers and reports that tell us about the learning rates of these various technologies. And so what's happening on the fission side is that by having this plethora of options, we've been able to find customers that can help us get over that first of a kind hump. So in particular, hyperscalers, as we've already mentioned, and data center vendors in general have a long enough outlook and deep enough pockets to actually want to buy into this technology and be able to buy down that full learning curve themselves. And I think that's one thing that's, especially over the last year, really transformed the fission world.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe adding like one more point there, because you brought up a really great point about the array of options on the fission side and the different sizes. I think one of the challenges there is also just like having certain things apply across that size range. So for example, and we get pitched a lot of companies, so I think it's safe to say that there are plenty of microreactor developers out there that would say that they can build their first unit for 100 million or less. Maybe it'll be more or less. On the licensing side, the cost estimates I've been hearing from folks who want to develop AP1000 projects are in the range of 80 to 100 million to get, just for the licensing activities, not to get to FID. You've probably heard these too.
Yeah.
So those are the same order of magnitude. So it's a very different ratio of like regulatory to financing risk for these microreactors versus a AP1000, which might cost 20 billion for the next one after Vogtle to get built, maybe 15, who knows. And so that's something that I think is interesting to think about. Like if we want to support the development of an array of options, like how do you scale costs, or how do you make it accessible to multiple levels, and what is the right level of requirements for facilities at these different scales?
And that's interesting because that's a conversation that's going on right now. And the U.S. nuclear regulator was directed under the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act of 2019 to look at what the appropriate regulatory framework for fusion would be. And they said byproduct materials licensing framework, which was foundational to enabling R&D to move forward and enable projects to move forward and kind of build, innovate, disrupt, see what's working, take things apart, remake it again, in a way that the fission industry never could. Because fission, you can't build a reactor without first getting an NRC license, and an NRC license is very expensive and takes a long time. You can't change your reactor without doing a license amendment, which is very expensive and takes a very long time. And so it's one of the things that when you look at where the government can enable technologies to come to market, or impede it, that regulatory framework was critical for fusion. And but they also came to the right answer because they looked at the first principles of what is this technology, how does it work, what are the types of materials that we're using, what are the types of accident cases, scenarios that we look at, and then where does this fit, which is a right way for a safety regulator to look at it, and they came to the right answer. The international community is looking at this as well. There's some discussion about whether you should regulate fusion under a fission framework, but the people who have actual fusion technologies, the countries that actually have fusion technologies, when they've looked at it, all of the regulators have determined, that's not the right framework. Our radioactive materials licensing one is. So the UK has looked at this as well. And they're being very influential in the international discussions. But that kind of brings me over to kind of maybe the next part of the discussion is, where can the US government support these technologies for deployment? I'm just going to break it into fusion and then go to fission. Sorry for the kind of back and forth, but they're two very different discussions, right? And Carly, you intrigued me earlier where you said the fusion community could really benefit from some of the incentives and support that the fission community received by the federal government. So where are these places where we can see private-public partnerships and where the US government can help enable a technology to be deployed so that it can reach commercialization and widespread deployment? So I'm going to start with fusion. So I'm going to go to you, Carly, then you, Phil, then I'm going to go to fission, and I'm going to go to you, Derek, all right?
Okay, well, this is Phil's to talk about. He already mentioned it, but I think we have to start with the ARPA-E organization, program managers, leaders, right, who really kicked off and enabled a lot of the fission approaches that are now out there building plants. I mean, that was critical to get these ideas out of the ideas of researchers and onto a path towards commercialization. I think the parallel with fission between the DOE GAIN program and the DOE INFUSE program, GAIN on the nuclear fission side and INFUSE on the fusion side, has also been incredible for having labs or research groups with very different fields of expertise contribute in a meaningful way to the goals of the entire ecosystem. On the GAIN side of things, the International Lab team did amazing work. I think it was them on surveying all of the coal-fired power plants in the US and identifying which of them have infrastructure that is amenable to conversion towards a nuclear plant. And that research has been used even by folks outside of fission, in fusion, in bioenergy, and other places. It's been really transformative. So they don't even have to just be technology projects. Infuse has done similar things in the material science and I believe blanket space as well. Moving upwards, the Advanced Reactor Development Program, or the ARDP, which is currently funding X-Energy and TerraPower, like those, that has been such catalytic capital, and I know the X-Energy folks a little bit better than Phil can probably speak to TerraPower, but like in terms of bringing in private investors, in terms of bringing in commercial partners, it's basically been like a project development company before there are project developers in the advanced reactor space. I know that's now unlocked capital from the partners as well on the ground. So, you know, 1.2 billion potentially in government investment is going to create, you know, easily, I think, 4x that in capital coming in. And it hasn't even been deployed yet. That is unlocked, I think, based on invoicing. So as progress is made, the taxpayer supports and rewards that company for doing that. So we'd love to see that model applied to fusion as well. Phil mentioned COTS. That was another fantastic example. Maybe I'll let you speak more to that. I was looking this up earlier, and I believe SpaceX got 1.6 billion for that initial, not through COTS, through the follow-on funding to fund the mission to actually bring stuff to the space station. Just as an order of magnitude, capital COTS was hundreds of millions.
Yeah, I think the first tranche was some hundreds of millions, and I think there was follow-up after that.
Okay.
All right, Phil, you get the mic.
Well, so let me plug just a couple things which I think are a really good framework for thinking both about progress in fusion energy and then the right level of government support interacting with the private sector. So first, let me give a plug to a post that Bob Mumgard from CFS put out there, which is called Building Trust in Fusion Energy. Please look it up. But basically what it talks about is why it is that you can set up a framework where you can build trust on the part of investors, the public, governments, that these different fusion concepts are actually moving towards a positive result. So I highly recommend that, and that's very in line with our investment philosophy and how we look at the different fusion concepts. Now, based on that, and why we think it is possible to measure fusion and put milestones and be responsible to taxpayer money when dealing with private industry, I highly recommend that people look up the Commission for Scaling Fusion Energy that put out a report last month. So the two congressional chairs of this commission are Jim Risch, who's a Republican senator, and Maria Cantwell, who's a Democratic senator. But they put forward a bunch of suggestions. I think it's about a 20-page report. But probably the two most important ones were the National Academies has been doing great work for a really long time. The Chinese government is a huge fan of these reports. They read these reports, and then they do it in China. But these reports in 2020, in particular the Fusion Energy Sciences Advisory Commission, basically laid out a bunch of kind of, you know, tragedy of the commons type problems in science and engineering that would be applicable to a whole bunch of different concepts. And so what they say in that report from the Commission on Scaling Energy is they said, here's kind of a list of what you should fund on the side of the government, where you can have the national labs, universities working in parallel with the different private companies to really get to what we need to for a commercial reactor ASAP. But then the other part of this, which I mentioned before, is, look, we look across the technology landscape and we say, where is the United States still very competitive, and where should it really be pushing its advantage, and what can it learn from? I think one of the biggest technology success stories is, you could talk about market share that the US has in a bunch of stuff, but one place where the US is really in advance is that over 85% of the payloads to orbit last year were American, and of course the majority of those were from SpaceX. But what has been referred to before is that there was a program that was pioneered, and SpaceX gets a lot of credit for this, as does NASA, as does some of the other companies, where they did this commercial orbital transport services. And the principle of this was that you set a big goal, which was resupply the International Space Station, and then the government and the private companies, and it was more than just SpaceX, but SpaceX is the one that eventually went all the way, they basically agree on a set of milestones where they say, okay, here are the important milestones, you know, test the rocket engine, you know, get to this altitude, et cetera, that we think would indicate that you are eventually going to hit this long-term goal. And so what would happen is that NASA would only pay the companies when they actually hit that milestone, and then it was up to private capital and private industry to take the risk. So what happened, which is a huge success story, started under the first Trump administration, was that there was a similar program that was set up for fusion, which is called the milestone-based cost share program. And I'm a huge fan of this, because what it does is it basically says, let's have a two-key system, which gives a lot of confidence to both the government, the taxpayers, and private capital as to what the important measurable milestones are to show that we're actually going to get to the end goal. And then what happens is that private capital takes the risk, and only if the companies actually achieve the milestone does the government actually come in and pay. So what this allows is it allows a signal for people to try a bunch of different stuff, but then it also has a way of down selecting to the ones that are actually working. It worked for SpaceX. It's one of the reasons why we're very competitive in space. And so when we look at all the stuff that's happening in China, can't fault them for investing in fusion. We think it's a good idea. But ultimately, if we try to just outspend the Chinese government one for one, who I think are already spending twice as much as the US government, that might be tough under any circumstances, but we think that there's a much more efficient way to do it. And so following the recommendations in that report, if you could ever appropriate the cost share program to what was appropriated for the ARDP, that was $2.5 billion, that would not only supercharge public investment, but it would also be a signal to private capital, where I think you get a massive amplifier in the amount of private capital that came into fusion if you had the government coming in substantially for this two-step system. Now, the Commission on Scaling Energy said a one-time appropriation of $10 billion. That would be great. The more money, the better. But I think if we can just start to get the government stepping in with billions of dollars, geared like ARDP towards the private sector and not just, things like ITER and the national labs, I think you're going to see a huge amplification on the private side, and that's really going to be the best use of kind of public-private partnerships to get this over the finish line.
That's great. And then the paper that Phil is referring to came out by the Strategic and Competitive Studies Program, or project. So it's SCSP, if you're Googling it and trying to find it. So thank you for that. And it's actually interesting. I think we've seen a shift and an appetite recently with DOE at looking at more this milestone-based funding to de-risk its investment, among a whole host of other things, because historically there's been a number of projects that have received very big funding opportunity awards that were never commercialized, were never going to be commercialized. They had a lot of potential that was never realized, and eventually people could start seeing the writing at the wall, and organizations like DOE were forced to look at, well, we've already put so much money in, should we just continue to put this money in to see if we can get them across the finish line, right? Even though the technology has changed, the scenario has changed, a lot of different things. So I think shifting over to this, and one of the things that we can see that is one of the best things to help move that along is switching over to OTAs, other transaction authorities, for agreements, for types of agreements that you can enter into with DOE that are just a little bit more flexible. And so I think there's just a shift there, an interest in Congress of seeing more milestone-based funding, and within the DOE, and they're trying to look at how is the private sector doing this. It's kind of VC-based milestone funding. You open your next tranche after you reach your milestone type approach. And so with that, let's switch over to Fission. Can you talk about some of the support that you're seeing for Fission, how that has kind of helped transform the landscape? And I know you dabble in Fusion too, so if you want to talk about how some of these programs could work for something like Fusion, feel free, Derek.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first I have to agree that public-private partnerships are really the way forward. And I do think that we've been proving that principle out with some of the Fission programs. But going back to what you said about China, I want to point out that on the Fission end, China is also making tremendous advances, right? They have something like 25 reactors under development right now in China, advanced reactors, right? And if you look at that, you would say, well, maybe we're in the United States, maybe we're behind, right? But what we have that's different in the United States is this incredible engine for innovation, right? Both through the national labs, our university system, and then our funding mechanisms through our venture capital system, right? And so what we're trying to do on the federal government level is basically create an environment that allows all those different pieces to come together and create the best technology and get the best technology on the grid, right? So where China just goes and says, we're going to build one of everything, right? Because they can do that. We're going to let the private market and all the innovation that happens in the United States, come up with the best ideas, get the proper capital for the best ideas, and get them deployed on the grid. And as we do that, we're going to end up with a solution that works properly for our different environment here in the United States and allows us to race ahead at that point. And I think that's something that's going to work on both the fission and the fusion side in our favor here in the United States. And so on the fission side, we've already talked about ARDP. I mentioned earlier some of the tax incentive capabilities now within the United States. We were talking about other transaction authority, for instance, and milestone-based programs, which have been ramping up in general within the government, including our recently announced, not yet awarded Gen 3 Plus program that's putting out nearly $1 billion for helping to get Gen 3 Plus fission reactors off the ground, is using that. And then we're seeing, for instance, the military starting to get involved here as well with using OTA capabilities, like the DIU, for instance, the Defense Innovation Unit, recently has started a process of buying microreactors to go on military bases, and they're using OTA authorities and milestone-based approaches to go forward with those purchases. And I think that is that's a path that we need to see fusion go down as well. So I agree that having something similar to the ARDP program that can help take the technology readiness level of these private entities and pick them up to the point where they can start to deploy, and then have that backing of the federal government help de-risk the market a little bit so that we can see the venture capital firms getting a little bit more involved, like we did on fission, would certainly help. And then I think there's going to need to be several different milestone-based programs throughout the government, both military, Department of Energy, and otherwise, to also help purchase some of these reactors and start to get them deployed.
So one of the examples that I really like to cite, and the Department of Defense loves this because it makes them look good, is Project Pele, right? So Project Pele was an OTA. It was the Department of Defense putting out a request for designs for microreactors, but it had specific performance specs that it needed to meet. Needed to be fully transportable on the back of a C-17. It needed to be able to be operated at a forward operating base. It needed to be, I think, buried underground, potentially remotely operated, and fully transportable, and it needed to be NRC licensable. And right now, they down-selected from originally Westinghouse, X-Energy, and BWXT to BWXT for the first Project Pele award, and they're going to be done with their prototype this year, I think in 2025. Then they also selected X-Energy for kind of like the next round after that. But the reason that I find that that program is so important is not what it's doing for the military or in military innovation or anything like that. It's because when I go into the NRC with the microreactor industry, and so the oil and gas industry went in and said, hey, NRC, we want to deploy mass deploy microreactors, and we want them to be licensable within 6 months of the time we got an order for it, and the overall NRC licensing cost can't be more than 1% of the total unit cost. And the NRC said, we think we can do that. They would never have said that if Pele didn't exist and they hadn't already had their paradigm disrupted about how nuclear could be delivered and how microreactors could be delivered, and that they could be transportable and mobile and mass manufactured in a factory, remotely operated, and be able to be deployed on site with limited on-site work. So the fact that DoD was willing to be a prime mover there and kind of change how people started to think about this was instrumental in having the nuclear regulator think about it differently for microreactor deployment. And that was really exciting to see. Yeah. And so I'm going to take some...
If I could...
Yeah.
I absolutely agree that Project Pele blazed a path. And I think we all owe a debt of gratitude for that project. It was really doing microreactors before all the rest of us were really thinking about it, if you really look back at it. One thing I want to mention, though, is also that Project Pele is getting built at Idaho National Lab, right? And so I wanted to point out that the government can also play other roles in this process, such as accelerating licensing for building some of these first reactors, right? So right now at Idaho National Lab, we have several different capabilities, the Lotus facility, the Dome facility, where we're having private companies come in and build their first-of-a-kind reactors. And this is one way to kind of de-risk some of these new technologies as well, where they're using DOE licensing authority for those instead of NRC licensing. So I think this is something that is maybe not very widely known, but the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the NRC all have the capability to license reactors. And so the Department of Energy uses that capability generally for research reactors, but we're also using it for these kind of first-of-a-kind deployment of private reactors as well. And I think that's a model that should, again, be emulated over on the fusion side. Now, of course, fusion doesn't have the NRC at this point to go through for building a reactor, which is really great for fusion. Sorry, building a device. I'm not sure which nomenclature.
Machine.
But we don't want to call it a reactor. Yeah. But I still think that the national labs, the government and the national labs can play a role in helping to accelerate kind of the build out of some of these first devices by providing land, by providing resources, and, those types of capabilities.
And I think we're seeing the national labs really step up with an appetite for trying to work with the private sector to come up with some creative solutions about how they can share resources, IP, land, lab space, and really kind of enable technologies to come to market much sooner than they otherwise would have. Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Maybe one quick comment. I think I made the same comment last year, but a streamlined CRADA development and approval process would be awesome.
Yes.
That's my comment.
Yes. And having headquarters looped in sooner rather than having the INL or the RNLs negotiate them themselves, and understanding where these changes can be made and where they can't be made, and what is just a preference, which is versus what are you required to have in here. So, I mean, I feel like every time you negotiate a CRADA, you're starting from scratch. And I'm sitting there in a room with people and I'm like, I know you can do this because I did this last year on a different project with you. Why are you acting like you've never heard this before? So a streamlined process, I think, would be really, really important. That's a really good add. I'm so going to ask a few questions from the audience. What is the potential for crossover of standards for nuclear energy and fission and fusion, from radiation shielding to grid interface technologies, and what are the important characteristics that enable modularity and rapid deployment? So maybe I think that's a you, Derek, question, if that's correct, and if anybody else wants to weigh in, they can.
So, I'm sorry, can you say it one more?
No, it was a long question. All right. What is the potential for crossovers of standards for nuclear energy in fission and fusion, from radiation shielding to grid interface technology? And what are important characteristics that enable modularity and rapid deployment?
I'm actually not sure I have a great answer to that, to tell you the truth. On the end of radiation shielding, obviously there's a huge history for radiation dose management from nuclear reactors, and those same standards are probably going to get applied over on the fusion side as well, as far as if we're looking at radiation either coming out of the device or related to other processing external to the device, like tritium processing, that sort of thing. The same type of standards, I think, will get applied for monitoring radiation dose. And then on shielding, I think that's going to be similar as far as the amount of shielding that you're going to have for the neutron spectrum that you're looking at from a fusion device. But of course, there's going to be differences just due to the difference in spectrum, that sort of thing. So I'm not sure I have the best answer.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And I'll cover some of it too, so Carly.
Yeah, Derek, I liked your answer around what is dangerous to a human body, right? Like, we have a lot of standards for that. They are very conservative. If you think about the number of cross-country flights that we take, I know I could work in a nuclear plant for probably 1,000 years and I wouldn't do as much harm there. In terms of, they're just such different systems from a shielding standpoint. I don't even know how you can like the fission neutrons are very low energy, but there's a lot of other materials around that can be activated. On the fusion side of things, they're higher energy neutrons, but those are like a shorter, they're going to hit things faster, and so everything is really contained within the blanket that you need to actually capture that energy. Phil's going to reframe that in a much more articulate way, but my mind has just been because I'm like, yeah, like it's just really different.
Yeah, I mean, they both involve nuclei and neutrons, but other than that, they're actually, quite different. And, I think the NRC took the right approach, which is to basically say we shouldn't just, take a Sharpie and kind of redline the fission rules. Instead, we should see what we can learn from fission, but really have a bottoms-up analysis of what the actual risks and appropriate kind of framework is. So, yeah, I mean, I think, look, fusion is hard to start, fission is hard to stop. There's a lot of very important differences. And so I think the much better thing, which I think is the way we're going, is to learn what you can in terms of remote maintenance, what to do with that pesky tritium, all that kind of stuff. But these are really different technologies. I think they can benefit from knowledge in a bunch of areas, but they really need to be looked at differently.
Where there is a lot of synergy is on that grid interconnection side, because now we're talking about roughly the same amount of power. We're talking about, compared to wind and solar, roughly the same amount of land. We're talking about the same amount of being dispatchable around the clock standpoint. And even with other thermal sources, like that is a fantastic area for standardization.
I will say, having worked on both the fission and fusion side, I find that the materials licensing space is a lot easier. Like that, when I'm trying to look at precedent, I look at the materials licensing space. Like, what are accelerators doing? What are cyclotrons doing? What are medical isotope production facilities doing? That is much more helpful a space to look at for precedent or how something could be handled than the fission space. But the second part of this question was about enabling modularity and rapid deployment. And so one of the things that I look at when I'm trying to advise clients on this space is stop changing your design. Come up with a design, and that is your design, and then go ahead and build that. Limit how much of that is regulated, whether it's on the fission side, how much of that is going to be in your NRC license. On the fusion side, how much of that needs to be in your radioactive materials license. So how much of the facility and plant can you have be just a regular commercial facility and not need special materials, special reviews, limit what you can do to changes to involving those types of things. So I think being forward thinking about that as you design, simplicity is another thing. Simplicity, and then your materials. I was in Estonia, just happened to be at a company that manufactures batteries and capacitors, and they were like, oh, we just sent a bunch of capacitors over to the US for a fusion company. And I texted a whole bunch of fusion companies and said, I found you some capacitors if you're looking for them, right? But there's a limited amount of supplies out there. And so when you look at scaling, are you using a material that enables you to scale affordably, or are you pricing yourself out of the market? So I think these are some of the things that the companies can look at. All right, so another question from the audience.
Can I comment real quick on the grid interconnection part, which we didn't talk too much about. One special topic I want to bring up there is on the interconnection to data centers in particular, right? Since data centers are driving a lot of the momentum right now on the fission side, and I hope eventually on the fusion side as well, there's going to be a whole bunch of particularities of how we actually hook up these huge loads from data centers to energy generation sources like nuclear reactors and fusion devices. In particular, if we're looking at AI data centers, some of those are going to have loads that look like they're sitting at nothing, and then all of a sudden the entire machine ramps up to 90%. And then it sits there and trains for a day or two and then goes back down to nothing again. And that used to not be that big of a deal when a data center was maybe 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts, something like that. But with the data centers that we're seeing announced now, all the way up to 900 megawatts, gigawatt, we've even heard all the way up, whole data center centers at like 4 gigawatts, for instance, right? What does it mean whenever a data center goes from, let's say, pulling 1 megawatt to pulling a gigawatt in half a second, right? How do you handle that? And I think there's going to have to be a bunch of really interesting innovation on the grid connection end, both for behind the meter deployments and in front of the meter deployments for how to handle these huge loads.
And I think I would just add to that, besides kind of the technical issues associated, is also the public policy issues associated with it. And so right now there's a lot of conversations going on about how do you take a power plant that would normally be providing power to the grid and then let it do a behind-the-meter PPA or power purchase agreement, where all of a sudden those electrons aren't going to the grid anymore, they're going directly to a co-located data center. And then what impact does that have on energy reliability, affordability in the local communities? And if you have a finite amount of power, say the plant's at half use, who gets the power? Is it the data center? Where if they don't have constant cooling, the equipment can fail and cause a lot of damage, or is it like the local hospital, right? And so a lot of government agencies are looking at this. FERC is looking at this. It came up recently where they didn't allow a data center to increase its power output. They kind of punted on addressing the substantive issue, but FERC is continuing to look at it, and we're seeing a whole bunch of states passing legislation to restrict the ability of data centers to connect into the grid and take power away from the grid. And so data centers, it's one of the reasons that data centers are driven to find their own power source, but they still have a lot of issues. There are some states where the only companies that can provide power are electric utilities. There are some states that don't allow behind the meter. And so you've got to connect to the grid some way. And so understanding and appreciate what this landscape looks like, it's going to be evolving, but there's a lot of complexities that will need to be navigated.
I think I saw at least a couple of booths in the exhibit hall, hopefully addressing some of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, so we did get a question about the Loan Programs Office, which I don't think that we talked about. Does somebody want to cover this question? It's could the LPO start funding, doing fusion loans now in the billions of dollars range to address the undersourcing? Does anybody want to cover LPO? But is it?
I can give it.
Yeah, I can talk about it too, but yeah, go ahead, Phil.
I'll just say, I think Secretary Wright was giving an interview to Bloomberg, and he specifically talked about LPO potentially being used for support for nuclear. So, that, and obviously fission is more in that realm now than fusion is, but fusion would eventually benefit from this as well, which is that, the place where it makes sense to try to deploy this the most is technologies that are coming down the learning curve and have that kind of first of a kind, second of a kind, and minus something of a kind risk. And so using LPO to kind of help do the project finance for those early projects, super important, and we're eager to see the government kind of support that.
So I think to start this conversation, I would, first of all, I would be remiss, and my friend Julie Kozaraki from LPO would be pretty angry if I didn't mention that right now, given the tax incentives that we have in the government and LPO capabilities, you can get up to about 50% of your investment back on a fission reactor right now. And we've been talking about buying down risk and trying to help with capital investment. And that's one of the ways that the government is helping right now is buying down that risk through tax incentives, et cetera. And LPO plays a big role in that. One of the things, though, that I think a lot of people don't realize about LPO is that it's really there to finance projects that are building right now, right? It's not really early startup capital. It's not research and development money. You really have to have a plan for building immediately. And even if you look at the portfolio right now, LPO isn't funding a lot of advanced reactor builds either. They're funding things like the restart of Palisades and keeping Diablo Canyon open and things along those lines, right? Because those are concrete projects that they can pay for right now. And so we still need right now, private equity investment in order to get to the point where LPO can kind of take over and help these projects get built. And I think that that's shared on both ends of fission and fusion.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because there are so many companies who come to us as investors and their plan for to fund their first of a kind unit is DOE LPO, and that isn't what that organization funds. They do not take losses, right? They run very responsible projects that can be can be underwritten.
And they're meant for commercial projects. It's meant to accelerate
projects, yeah.
commercial projects. So it's not, even if someone's like, well, I'm going to build right now, they don't want to fund your prototype, right?
That's
so,
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we have just a couple minutes left. And so I just want to do some kind of closing remarks. What are kind of some big picture, get the crowd excited type comments we can leave everybody with? I'm going to just go down the row. Carly, sorry, you get the mic first.
Yes.
All right, we're going to do some big picture wrap-ups. What do you want to say?
I mean, I think we can deploy things. I'm just excited about the possibility to get things online soon if we all work together and everybody comes to the table. So I'd love to see microreactors on the grid in 5 years. A lot would have to happen for that to happen, but I think it's possible. And on the fusion side, I just want more folks to celebrate not just the financings, but also the milestone achievements of folks hitting technical targets, of siting plants, of hopefully hitting really interesting plasma times and capabilities in the next couple of years.
Great. All right, Derek.
So one thing I didn't get to mention yet, so I'll take this moment to mention it, is that there are some statutory issues within the government as far as keeping fission and fusion separate that I really think we need to break down. For instance, funding that goes into the Office of Nuclear Energy has a little piece on it that says it absolutely cannot be used for fusion purposes. And this creates all sorts of problems whenever we even just try to collaborate across the Department of Energy itself. It also creates problems for the money that we give out, for instance, from the Office of Nuclear Energy. If we're giving a grant, for instance, to a university for nuclear energy research, their proposal can't say anything in it about fusion. And it really should be the other way around, where if someone has an idea of how to fund some research to do that would benefit both fission and fusion, that's something the government should be incentivizing instead, right? So I just want to put it out there for anybody that has the ability to talk to your Congress people, that sort of thing. I think one of the things that would help accelerate both of these technologies is to break down some of those statutory issues that are keeping us from collaborating across the government. On the bigger picture end of things, I'll just say that I really hope to see both of these technologies really accelerating through the 2030s. I think we're going to see some of the first commercial deployments of fission reactors by that 2030 timeframe, but we're not really going to see kind of that bigger rollout until through the 2030s. On that note, what I'll mention is that if you have the idea that you're going to want to buy a fission reactor sometime in the 2030s, you need to be getting on the order books now because they are filling up, actually. And so, you don't want to wait too long and then not be able to get your project off the ground. And I hope that that's going to be the case on the fusion side as well.
Yeah, on the fission side, nobody has a problem with selling their nth of a kind reactor. They have a problem selling their first and their second. And there's rumbling of an Advance Act too, so hopefully we can get some of those statutory changes you mentioned rolled into that. And then Phil, final words.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I think we've got two amazing shots on goal here for decoupling energy from resource constraints and eventually, hopefully, getting to sustainable abundance for all. Obviously, there are challenges. Each of them have to tackle safety, waste, proliferation, and eventually cost. But there's an amazing opportunity here for the coupling of government support and research with private industry and private capital to really speed this towards commercialization. And so really excited about having that conversation ongoing. There's been, depending on the report you look at, $8 to $10 billion from private capital coming into fusion. Obviously, many multiples of that into fission so far. But I think the government can really act like a catalyst here. So I think it's a great conversation to have, just like what they did in space and in some other sectors. I think we've only seen a small portion of the private capital that can come into this if the government really acts constructively in a private-public partnership.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming here today. And thank you for our panelists for a great discussion.